By the way, I found that image through a Google Images search, and when I followed the link, I learned that that is a painting that, at least at the time that I looked at it, was for sale at an art gallery. My suspicion is that it's still for sale at that art gallery. I mean, isn't it awful? I mean, doesn't he look like he's summoning you to your doom? Right? Come this way. And that's the end of you, right? It's a dreadful, that's a dreadful painting. And yet, we need to start our discussion with Schumpeter, because I would like to suggest that to the extent that you have an idea in your head right now about what entrepreneurship is, chances are, even if you have never heard of the man until now, your conception of what entrepreneurship is Joseph Schumpeter's conception, right? So for Schumpeter, right, entrepreneurship is an act of what he calls creative destruction, right? So an entrepreneurial activity is activity that creates something new and novel, right? But at the same time, it destroys or pushes to the side or displaces the old. And so creative destruction, as you might imagine, has a creative element to it, right? So I love the imagery here. It's almost as if the candle inspires the idea of the light bulb, right? So if you think of or you talk about entrepreneurship in terms of innovation, right? And can we get more than 10 or 15 words into a discussion in a business school without using the word innovation, right? That's an indication that Joseph Schumpeter is the man of the hour. And why not? Over the last third of the century, we have seen jaw-dropping technological and particularly product innovation in our world. It's very easy for us to think of entrepreneurship as being fundamentally concerned with that. So, Schumpeter's creative destruction has a creative element. Innovation, right? Innovation comes from the Latin, yes, it comes from the Latin novus, meaning new, right? So, an entrepreneur we might think of as a bringer of things that are new. But Schumpeter didn't understand just anything new, anything novel that turned up as being the product of entrepreneurship. He was interested in these creations, in these innovations that had as one of their consequences the destruction or the displacement of something that was once central to our economic life. And so, I don't know, maybe a lot of people in this room are too young to remember when we thought that Blockbuster Video, right, had personal consumption of movies and TV shows locked up. Until suddenly what? You're smiling and nodding. Until what happened?
Until streaming came along.
Until streaming came along. Well, even before streaming came along. Until Netflix came along, right? And Netflix, even in its pre-streaming formulation, right? Mailing DVDs to people in these terribly clever envelopes, charging no late fees when Blockbuster's business model was built almost entirely on late fees, right? Netflix, right, helmed by Reed Hastings, right, was the innovator, the bringer of creative destruction that sent Blockbuster Video into liquidation. So, who is Schumpeter's entrepreneur? Schumpeter's entrepreneur is a disruptor, right? So, what's depicted here, right, is a market in equilibrium, right? A competitive market in equilibrium, right? Many buyers, many sellers, low barriers to entry, all the rest. A product that, if not a pure commodity, is at least a product making its way toward commodification, when suddenly, bam, here comes a Schumpeterian entrepreneur, an innovator, which says, I'm going to blow all of that stuff up, right? So who is Schumpeter's entrepreneur, right? Schumpeter's entrepreneur is like a stone thrown into a placid pool. The placid pool is the market in equilibrium. The stone is the thing that disrupts that placidity. the water is rippled, waves are formed in it, until what happens? What happens after you throw a stone into a placid pool? Eventually, if you hang around long enough. What happens? You were so helpful before, what happens?
It stops rippling, it goes back to being placid.
Right, so the disruption comes, it disarranges everything, but eventually the disarrangement becomes the new normal, the placidity is restored. And that's what happens, according to Schumpeter, in markets too. Markets get disrupted by entrepreneurial innovation, but eventually that innovation becomes the new normal until what? Another entrepreneur comes along and disrupts it again. Right? Now, I said earlier, our last third of a century of just jaw-dropping technological and particularly product innovation tends to make our understanding of entrepreneurship rather narrow and focused narrowly on these product innovations, right? But Schumpeter actually recognized three basic forms of innovation. One, as I've already mentioned, is product innovation. But that's not the only one that he recognized as significant. Another one is process innovation. The product is the same as it ever was, but the process by which we produce it, right, or the process by which we handle distribution or what have you, changes, and as a result, it revolutionizes the industry, even if at the level of the consumption of the product remains the same. Schumpeter also recognizes what you might call market innovation, which is the product remains the same and the process remains the same, but you find new and perhaps heretofore unintended uses for the product, and you reach a market that at least at the outset you never thought you were going to reach. All of these he understood to be forms of entrepreneurial innovation. Now, right, if you're looking for a modern day exemplar of something like the Schumpeterian view of what entrepreneurship is, creative destruction, or in this thinker's terms, disruptive innovation, you would think of someone like the Harvard Business School's Clayton Christensen, right? His celebrated 1997 book, The Innovator's Dilemma. The conception of entrepreneurship that he's working with is very much a Schumpeterian, creative destruction, innovation sort of focus. I just want to point out three things about the Schumpeterian conception of entrepreneurship. The first one, and this is not surprising since the Schumpeterian conception involves creative destruction. The first thing that I want to point out is that in the Schumpeterian conception, the entrepreneurial act is inherently creative. It's innovative. It brings something new. The second one is that it is uncommon, right? There may be many people engaging in a lot of different kinds of activity in the marketplace, but only a subset of them, and perhaps a small subset of them, are entrepreneurs in Schumpeter's sense. And the third, as we just discussed, is that the entrepreneur is a disruptive force. The entrepreneur comes to a market in equilibrium and sends it, like a stone thrown into a placid pool, into disequilibrium. So, this conception of entrepreneurship that most of us are working with today, because Schumpeter is the man of the hour, is Schumpeterian creative destruction. So you might say at this point, well, okay, sure, that sounds comfortable. How else might you think about entrepreneurship? Enter Israel Kirzner. Israel Kirzner, right, has a very different conception of what entrepreneurship is. And we'll see just how different in a moment. But in order to understand what Kirzner is doing through his conception of entrepreneurship, it helps to understand that Kirzner is an economist of the Austrian School of Economics, and his account of entrepreneurship is itself a fallout of more basic commitments of his teacher, Ludwig von Mises, right? So Ludwig von Mises, in his 1949 treatise, Human Action, you may think that's a strange name for a treatise of economics, but in point of fact, it's not, because Because in building up Mises's edifice of economics, he wants to start with just a really basic question about human beings. Why do human beings act? Why do we act? Why do we not forever sit motionless, right, and in equanimity? Well, I don't know. You seem to be sitting that way now, motionless and in equanimity. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe human beings don't act. But you acted in order to come here, and presumably, when I finish mercifully 42 minutes hence, you will probably act again, at least to move yourself out of the room, right? So why do human beings act? Why do we not forever sit motionless and in equanimity? Why does anybody do anything, ever? No one wants to venture an idea? Okay, raised eyebrows. Why do human beings act? You just acted. You raised your eyebrows. Why?
Well, to survive, perhaps?
Unpack that a little, right? Why might survival or the desire to survive prompt you to act? Will you survive if you don't act?
Of course not. Is that a serious question?
That's a serious question.
Okay, no.
So no, you won't, right? And you desire to survive,
You could say that.
right? And so maybe recognizing that if you don't act, you won't survive, and wanting to survive, you seek to act and to take actions in particular that might provide for your future survival. Correct?
You could say that.
Okay, I did say that, right? So Mises accounts for human action by what he calls felt unease. Human beings act, says Mises, because they feel uneasy, and then they work to dissipate the unease that they feel. You might have unease about your future survival, right? And that prompts you to act in a way that might provide for your future survival. So what does Mises mean by this felt unease? The way I like to cash it out is this way. We feel uneasy when we perceive a difference between what is and what could be. If what could be is better than what is, we form action plans in order to achieve what could be and to leave what is. But it works in the other direction too. Maybe what could be is worse than what is, but that might prompt you to act. How? You recognize that what could be is worse than what is, and yet you're moved to act. You feel uneasy. Why? Or what might you do in that case? You recognize that what could be is worse. You say, hey, things are pretty good right here, right now, where I am, but what could be, what's lying around the corner, may be worse. What might you do?
Prevent.
I'm sorry?
Prevent.
You might work to prevent what could be. Right? If it's around this corner, you might run in the other direction. Right? That's one thing you can do. Or maybe you say, well, I don't really know how to prevent this could be that's worse, but maybe I can insulate myself in some way from the effects of what could be if I take appropriate action. Anyone who has ever purchased an insurance policy has done exactly that. They've recognized that what could be is worse than what is, and they've taken action to ameliorate the effects of that worse situation. Why? By taking out insurance against it. Right? So Mises's account of human action is built on the idea of felt unease. Kerzner's account of entrepreneurship is an extension of this basic idea. So what is it that entrepreneurs do, right? Entrepreneurship for Kerzner is marked by what he calls alertness. Entrepreneurs are alert to things in the world in a way that other people, non-entrepreneurs, might not be. Although Kerzner emphasizes there is an entrepreneurial element, he says, to all human action, for the reasons that we talked about, right? So entrepreneurs are alert, according to Kerzner, but what are they alert to? Kerzner's answer is opportunities. Right? So for Kerzner, the entrepreneur is someone who scans the horizon and sees these things that Kerzner calls opportunities. When they see opportunities, entrepreneurs act to pursue or to exploit those opportunities. But what kinds of opportunities are entrepreneurs, for Kerzner, interested in? The answer for Kerzner is arbitrage opportunities. Now, what is arbitrage? Anybody encounter that, say, in a finance class, what have you? If you did, no one will fess up to it, right? The answer actually is already on the screen, right? What is arbitrage? You've been helpful before. Yeah. So arbitrage opportunities are opportunities to buy low and to sell high, profiting on the difference between the low price at which you bought and the high price at which you sell, pocketing the difference, right? If you see an opportunity like that, are you going to jump on it? I hope so, right? Those are the kinds of opportunities you like. So pure arbitrage works this way. In pure arbitrage, you exploit a difference in prices between two markets. So gold is selling for $801 an ounce in London and $800 an ounce in New York. What's the arbitrage opportunity? It's 800 in New York, it's 801 in London. Come on. Bunches of you are here are business students. You should leap at this like moths to the flame. What's your opportunity? You're looking thoughtful.
$1.
Well, yes, your opportunity is $1, but by doing what? You buy the New York gold at 800 and you sell London gold at 801 and you pocket the difference, right? Now, as you keep buying New York gold, what happens to the price? Yeah, the two prices we have, but you're in New York. You're buying New York gold at $800 an ounce, and you keep buying New York gold. What happens to the price? It'll go up. And you keep selling gold in London at 801. What eventually happens to the price? It'll go down, right? So the prices will tend to converge, and the arbitrage opportunity will disappear. So that's pure arbitrage. That's not really, for Kerzner, what most entrepreneurs do, but it is the purest and clearest example. Entrepreneurs, for Kerzner, engage in what you might call intertemporal arbitrage, right? Entrepreneurs are people who see opportunities, or what they think are opportunities, to sell goods at a high price with resources that can be combined for a lower price. So an entrepreneur is someone who sees, or thinks he or she sees, an opportunity to sell a product in the future for $12 that it only costs $9 to put the factors of production together to produce, pocketing the $3 difference, right? Somebody who says there's a 12 out there for 9 is, for Kerzner, an entrepreneur, right? And so, Shane and Venkatraman, probably, their 2000 papers, probably the most cited thing in the academic literature and entrepreneurship over the last 20 years. They would be kind of contemporary carriers on of the Kerznerian idea. They lean very heavily on the idea of entrepreneurship being concerned with opportunity recognition and exploitation. Now, I want to point out 3 interesting features about Kerznerian entrepreneurship. One is that entrepreneurs, rather than engaging in creation, right, they explore and discover what? Opportunities, right? So opportunities, in a sense, are not innovations. They are not creations of the entrepreneur. They are things out there in the world to be discovered and to be pursued or exploited, right? The second thing is that for Kerzner, entrepreneurship is common. Again, this shouldn't be surprising. Kerzner says in his 1973 book, Competition and Entrepreneurship, he says there is an entrepreneurial element in all human action. Well, if that's true, then entrepreneurship might be far more widespread than it is in the Schumpeterian formulation. You don't have to be a world-changing innovator in order to be an entrepreneur. If you are a world-changing innovator, you are an entrepreneur for Kerzner. But so are you an entrepreneur even if you just pursue what seems at first blush to be a relatively mundane opportunity. The third thing that I want to see in the arbitrage example, right, where the prices in two markets converge, should illustrate this, is that Kerzner sees the entrepreneur's action as fundamentally harmonizing. That is, it equilibrates the market. Opportunities are disequilibrium situations, and entrepreneurial action brings the market, or brings the markets, into greater equilibrium. We're two conceptions of entrepreneurship in, and already it seems like we've got quite a problem in our conception of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is either creative or it's discovery-oriented. It's either uncommon or it's common, and it's either disruptive or harmonizing. Got that? Feel good about what entrepreneurship is? So you might say, well, wait, hash out for me how Schumpeterian and Kerznerian entrepreneurship might differ. Perhaps the easiest way is by considering the copycat entrepreneur. Right? What's a copycat entrepreneur? What do you imagine I mean by that? When I
The same business does the exact same thing, well, different business.
Yeah.
Does
So
the exact same thing.
So somebody starts a new business that looks an awful lot like an existing business, right? So, you know, my mother's best friend, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, my mother's best friend loved this restaurant called Eric's Deli Cafe in Los Gatos, California. She and her husband ended up moving to Kentucky, and they opened a restaurant that was a carbon copy, right, of Eric's Deli Cafe. Was she, in opening that restaurant, a Schumpeterian creative destruction entrepreneur? No, not at all, right? Just replicating someone else's business model, right? Is she a Schumpeterian, or excuse me, is she a Kerznerian entrepreneur?
Yes.
Well, presumably, if she's starting a new business, it's because she's recognized an opportunity to profit, right? So copycat entrepreneurs are Kerznerian, but are not Schumpeterian entrepreneurs. The thing that I want you to get from this is that entrepreneurship is a contested concept. And what I mean by that is this: there's widespread agreement that entrepreneurship is something important. But then you ask people, what is entrepreneurship? And you start getting answers. Like Schumpeter's, like Kerzner's, you start getting answers that diverge and that may even conflict. So we all think it's important, but we don't agree on what it is. So why does this matter? You might say, Professor Marcoux, I can tell that you are a real geek for the history of economic thought, and you know it must really fill you with energy and enthusiasm to plumb these divergent accounts of what entrepreneurship is. But why should I care? Right? Why does it matter whether you have, say, a Schumpeterian or, say, a Kerznerian conception of entrepreneurship? Why does it matter? Right? What would it mean to say that one of these thinkers, or that you, or that me, or that anyone else has the wrong conception of entrepreneurship? Right? What would it mean to get that wrong? So far, it's kind of hard to see, right? What it seems like we have is we have two thinkers who are each animated by different economic processes. Kerzner says, I think disruptive innovation, or Kerzner says, I think opportunity recognition and exploitation is really cool, and so I think we should call that entrepreneurship. Schumpeter, meanwhile, says, I think disruptive innovation is really cool. I think we should call that entrepreneurship. If that's all that's going on, then it sounds like the dispute over entrepreneurship is academic in the worst possible sense. Each of the thinkers is just kind of thumping his chest, saying, my favorite economic process is entrepreneurship. And if that's all that's going on, right, it doesn't really seem to matter. Well, I want to say that that's not what's going on. That there is something here that matters, and that it does matter which conception of entrepreneurship that we have, and that there are actual fallouts to getting it wrong. But in order to explain that, I need to retreat into, well, I think I said earlier, I'm a philosopher. And you need to retreat into philosophy and talk a little bit about modernity, by which I mean the last 400 years, and talk about the political philosophy of modernity. And I'm going to do that with a little help from my friend, Nick Capaldi, also a philosopher, right? So in two books, one of them called Two Narratives of Political Economy, and the other one called Liberty and Equality in Political Economy, Capaldi argues that there's something very interesting and important that separates the modern world, by which I mean roughly the last 400 years, from the pre-modern world, right? The world before. The thing that separates the modern world from the pre-modern world, Capaldi calls the technological project. The technological project is humanity's attempt to amplify both the quantity and the quality of human life through the acquisition and the application of knowledge in the natural and the physical sciences. By the acquisition of knowledge in the natural and the physical sciences, you should think of something like basic science. The application of those things, you think about something like applied science or technology. The thing that separates the modern world from the pre-modern world, right, is this headlong attempt to discover as much as we can about the natural world in order to make human life the best that it can be. Now you're looking at me right now and you're saying, well, duh, Professor Marcoux. And Professor Marcoux says back, well, duh, because we're all products of modernity. But that's actually, in the broad history of human thought, a rather radical notion, right? The technological project gets started in René Descartes' Discourse on Method, 1637. He says, it is possible to reach knowledge that will be of much utility in this life, and so make ourselves masters and possessors of nature. This is a revolution in thinking. In the pre-modern world, we understood nature as an organism, and we thought that the human project was to figure out where humanity as a constitutive part of nature fit in. And if we fit ourselves into nature right, we would live off of what nature would give us. But Copernicus, Galileo, all the rest, right? This deeply impresses Descartes, and Descartes says the more we learn scientifically about the natural and the physical world, right, the more we come to see it not as an organism but as a mechanism, as a machine which, if we can unlock its secrets, we as human beings can manipulate to make it give us more of what we want in order to amplify both the quantity and the quality of human life, right? Francis Bacon put it more simply, but in Latin, which doesn't bother me because I teach at a Jesuit Catholic university, but it may be a shock to your senses. He said, scientia potentia est. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Now you're looking at me again and you're saying, well, duh, Professor Marcoux, of course knowledge is power. And I'm looking back at you and saying, duh, of course, right? Because you're a product of modernity, right? What did pre-modernity think about knowledge? Well, Go back to the Bible. Go back to the Old Testament. Go right to the beginning of the Old Testament. Go to Genesis. There are Adam and Eve frolicking in the Garden of Eden, paradise itself. And they can stay there for all eternity as long as they refrain from doing one thing. What is that one thing? You look like you know, and you're bursting. What is the one thing they had to do or not do in order to
Not eat the apple.
not eat the okay, right. Not eat the fruit. Not eat the fruit of what?
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
The tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge. What is the lesson about knowledge that is being conveyed there? It's dangerous. Right? It's disruptive of the human condition. Knowledge is a dicey thing. But with Descartes and with Bacon, we come to say, no, knowledge is not a dicey thing. Knowledge is power. This is a revolution in thinking for humanity. So what if there were a meme about Adam and Eve, right? It would be one of those where it says, you had one job, right? And they failed at that one job. So there we are. So all right. So that tells you the difference between modernity and pre-modernity, right? Here's where the political philosophy comes in. That's John Locke. Somebody who had deep influence on the founding of the American Republic, among other things, right? Capaldi says that this narrative, this story that he calls the Lockean liberty narrative. Locke gets it started, but thinkers since Locke have developed it. In fact, when I teach it, I like to call it the Locke-Smith liberty narrative, because it gets started with John Locke and it kind of reaches its zenith with Adam Smith, right? The Lockean liberty narrative, in Capaldi's telling, is a story about how we can derive the full fruits of the technological project. So, in effect, what Locke says to you is this. Do you want life-saving, life-extending, and life-enhancing pharmaceuticals? And you say yes. Yes, I do. Do you want technology like high-speed, powerful, pocketable telecommunications devices that allow you to communicate with anyone on the planet in real time? And you say, yes, I do. Even if you're only going to use it to send one another cute cat pictures and argue about politics, you want devices like that. Locke says, all right, I've got your attention now. If you want the full fruits of the technological project, here is how you go about getting them. The Lockean liberty narrative says the technological project is best pursued in a free market economy. This is an interesting thought, right? By a free market economy, I mean, at minimum, I mean basically two things. An economy marked by free operation of the price system and by free operation of the profit and loss system. Through free operation of the price system, we discover which are the things that conduce to human health, wealth, and well-being. This is kind of an elaboration on Friedrich Hayek's idea that the market is a discovery procedure. By free operation of the profit and loss system, what I mean is we discover which are the firms that make the best use of resources in creating the things that conduce to human health, wealth, and well-being. So in the Lockean narrative, if you want the full fruits of the technological project, you want a free market economy, free operation of the price system, and free operation of the profit and loss system. But you can't have a free market economy without limited government. Now, this is a more obvious step, right? If in order for the market to operate freely, government has to be limited, it has to be restrained, at least insofar, in my telling, as it doesn't interfere in the operation of the price system, and it doesn't interfere in the operation of the profit and loss system. An example of interference in the price system might be something like rent control, which just went statewide in my home state of California. Interference in the profit and loss system would be something like bailouts for politically favored business firms and corporations, right? The Lockean narrative continues. You can't have limited government without the rule of law. Now, the rule of law is a big, ugly, complicated topic. It cannot be covered in a speech. It cannot be covered in a 2-minute segment in a speech. It can't be covered in a course. So I'm only going to highlight 2 ideas under the rule of law. One is the idea that government officials are themselves limited by and can act only pursuant to law. That the law is not just whatever who's in charge says it is. That's one idea. And the second idea, which appears in Hayek and which appears in Michael Oakeshott and some other thinkers, is the idea of law consisting in the main of general and abstract rules of conduct. Law is not a set of direct orders to do this and to refrain from doing that, and different for you than for you than for you. Instead, it's a set of general rules that each of us are bound to follow as we go about trying to do whatever it is that we value or we wish to pursue. The Lockean narrative continues. You cannot have the rule of law without an underlying cultural commitment. And that is the commitment to having what Capaldi calls a culture of personal autonomy. Right? In a culture of personal autonomy, right, we celebrate and we venerate people who lead self-directed lives. The word autonomy comes from the Greek, auto meaning self, and nomos meaning rule. Right? So a self-directed life is a life in which, as the metaphor goes, your life is a story and the pen that writes that story is in your hands. Unless we celebrate and venerate people leading self-directed lives, right, we can't really much see the point in the rule of law. So that makes this a kind of cross-sectional diagram of the Lockean liberty narrative. The technological project depends upon the free market economy, which depends upon limited government, which depends upon the rule of law, which rests ultimately on a culture of personal autonomy. Why is this important? The technological project is the motivation for getting our politico-economic institutions right. Free markets, limited government, and rule of law are the institutional framework, according to the Lockeans, that allows you to derive the full fruits of the technological project. And the culture of personal autonomy is the underlying cultural commitment that makes sense of it all. What does this liberty narrative have to do with entrepreneurship? The answer is it has everything to do with entrepreneurship. That is because, who's that? A young Steve Jobs, right? It is because the entrepreneur is the lead actor in this drama. The entrepreneur, by way of the free market economy, is the ideal pursuer of the technological project. The entrepreneur reads the tea leaves of the market to figure out what to make for people, to amplify both the quantity and the quality of their lives. But the entrepreneur, at least in liberal capitalist societies like our own, is also the ideal exemplar of a culture of personal autonomy. If you ask, who's leading a self-directed life? You know, you probably want to say someone like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, right? This is not accidental. So why does this make the Schumpeter-Kerzner tilt not just an exercise in chest thumping? Well, the answer is because it means within the confines of the Lockean narrative, entrepreneurship is special. Entrepreneurship is the name we give to the source of advancement in the technological project. Is it these very splashy quantum leaps that Schumpeter celebrates that does the most to amplify the quantity and quality of human life? Or, splashy as those things are, is it perhaps instead just the incremental improvements in human well-being, right, that are many more numerous, that are built on top of those innovations, that instead does the most to amplify the quantity and quality of life? If you think it's one, but it's actually the other, you've gotten something wrong that's really important. So it matters what your conception of entrepreneurship is. How might this play out in public policy? Well, let's think about one aspect of public policy. Let's think, and We're talking about entrepreneurs, and we're talking about entrepreneurs in the last third of a century. So this is big. Let's talk about patents, right? And so one question that we might have about patents is our patent regime good as it is? Should we be creating stronger and more stringent patent rights for inventors, right? Or is the patent system perhaps, and there was a lot of talk about this on the internet about 20 years ago, is the patent system itself strangling innovation and strangling the improvement of human life, right? Well, how might this play out through conceptions of entrepreneurship? If you have a Schumpeterian conception of entrepreneurship, you might think that having strong and perhaps even stronger patent rights for inventors might be very important so that those rare and peculiar people who have the capacity to engage in disruptive innovation have the relevant incentives to engage in entrepreneurship. So your horror story, if you're a Schumpeterian, is this. There is someone out there, maybe there is someone in this room who has the capacity for disruptive innovation. But through lack of appropriate incentives, instead of deciding to become an entrepreneur, an innovative entrepreneur, you opt for a job with a salary and a regular paycheck. Humanity has missed the opportunity to gain from your brilliance. Why? Because you didn't have the appropriate incentives to go an entrepreneurial path. But if you have a Kersnerian conception of entrepreneurship, you might worry that ever stronger patent rights might actually forestall the trial and error process that takes place after innovation occurs. People look at innovative products and say, that's good, but perhaps we can make it a little better by changing it in this way. And not just one person does that, but many such people do that. And most of them fail, right? Their variations on the innovation are actually not very good, right? Most entrepreneurs have a vision that's wrong, right? They see it and no one else does, and they go bankrupt. Right? But so the worry is that if it's those incremental improvements that do the most for us, if we build too big a perimeter around an original idea, we're not going to get that trial and error variation that actually may do more to push us forward in the technological project. So, two different conceptions of entrepreneurship, one public policy issue. I hope I've at least caused you to entertain the notion that entrepreneurial ideas are important and that they have consequences. Thank you.